So this module, we're going to look at IP addressing within Azure Virtual Networking. Now, there are two types of IP addresses that are available. We have public IP addresses, which are used for communication on the internet, and private IP addresses, which are used for internal Azure communication on VNets and subnets. They're also used to communicate with your on-premises network or an express route circuit. So the way this basically works is a public IP publishes something to the internet. A private IP represents the scope that you will use to internally communicate, or if you have a VPN that goes from your network into Azure, you will use routing rules to get from your internal virtual network or your internal physical network onto the Azure private networks. And then you'll use the IP addresses that are the private IPs within Azure for that. So where can we find public and private IPs? So for public IP addresses, we can find those in 4 locations. They can be on a virtual machine associated with a NIC. It could be dynamic or static. We can find them on a load balancer associated with the front end configuration of the load balancer. And again here, they can be both dynamic or static. We can find them on a VPN gateway. With a VPN gateway or an application gateway, they can be dynamic, they cannot be static. And the reason they can't be static is that Azure uses DNS names, internal DNS names, to route those. For private IP addresses, we find those on virtual machines as well, associated with a NIC, and then also on load balancers or application gateways associated with the internal side of those items. Public IP addresses come in 2 forms, basic and standard. A basic public IP is what essentially is kind of the legacy form of an Azure public IP. They can be assigned to a specific zone. They're not zone redundant. So it's something that you'll assign. They'll be there in that one zone you're in that one Azure region, and they'll stay there. And these can be assigned to any interface, VPN, or app gateway. A standard can only be assigned with static allocation. They can't be dynamic. And they are zone redundant. So they can move between zones. If something goes down and has to transfer, the public IP can actually move with it. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of a cost implication. A standard public IP costs a little bit more than a basic public IP. Creating a public IP in Azure is pretty straightforward. In most cases, when you create an object like a virtual machine, it will prompt you, do you want to have a public IP? And if you do, it'll create it automatically. But again, if you're planning and putting a proper virtual network infrastructure in place, you may very well want to do this in advance. And so you can use the marketplace to identify a public IP and create it. And once you do, you give it a name. Call this one VM1 public. The SKU, the version, whether it's static or dynamic. A DNS name. Has to be a globally unique name. It's going to tell me whether it's available or not. And then what resource group that this is going to be in. I'm going to use an existing resource group. I'm going to put this in the resource group that I have my VNet in. And then where I want that to be located. So I'll click Create. That creates the public IP. Now when I create a virtual machine down the road, I can actually specify that, hey, I want to use the public IP that I've already created and allocate it to a particular interface on a given virtual machine. Now, it's worth noting that for virtual machines with multiple network interface, only one of those interfaces can have a public IP. So one's designated as the public interface, and that one has a public IP associated with it. Any interface with a public IP is also going to have a private IP. It's not one or the other. Public IP is just something you can add to any given interface to give that interface inbound or outbound internet connectivity. So that's our look at IP addresses for Azure, both public IP addresses and private IP addresses.